Girl was found pregnant with a gorilla in the forest. What happened there is unbelievable. Anna couldn't help but smile as she packed her final research equipment into the weathered backpack. Her hands lingered on the satellite phone, a necessary evil in her mind, but one her research team insisted she take along. The device represented everything she was trying to leave behind: the constant connectivity, the noise of civilization, the endless stream of emails and calls from concerned colleagues. Her tiny apartment, usually cluttered with research papers and half-empty coffee cups, now looked unusually tidy. She'd spent the last week organizing everything, making sure nothing would go wrong during her extended stay in the jungle. The walls were covered with maps of Central Africa, each marked with careful notes about gorilla sightings and possible nesting areas. A collection of worn field guides sat stacked on her desk, their pages dog-eared and highlighted from countless late-night study sessions. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" The voice came from her doorway, where her mother stood with arms crossed, worry lines creasing her forehead. "Mom, we've been over this," Anna said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "This isn't just some whim. I've been working toward this expedition for years." Her mother stepped into the room, picking up a framed photo from Anna's desk. It showed a much younger Anna at her college graduation, beaming beside her father. "He would have been proud of you, you know. But he also would have told you to be careful." Anna felt the familiar pang in her chest at the mention of her father. He'd been the one who'd first sparked her interest in wildlife, taking her on camping trips and teaching her to track animals in their local woods. His death 5 years ago had only strengthened her resolve to follow in his footsteps as a researcher. The preparations had been meticulous. Anna had spent months studying the terrain, learning about local plants and their medicinal properties, and practicing survival skills. She'd even taken a wilderness first aid course, though she hoped she'd never need to use those skills. Her backpack contained everything she might need: water purification tablets, emergency rations, basic medical supplies, and enough research equipment to document every aspect of gorilla behavior she might encounter. The university had been surprisingly supportive of her solo expedition, though she suspected that had more to do with the potential publicity than any real faith in her abilities. Female researchers working alone in the field were still uncommon enough to draw attention, and any breakthrough findings would reflect well on the institution. As evening approached, Anna found herself in the research lab, double-checking her equipment one last time. The familiar smell of coffee and old books brought comfort as she worked, the quiet hum of computers providing a soundtrack to her final preparations. "Working late again?" The voice made her jump. Dr. Daniel stood in the doorway, his usual neat appearance slightly disheveled after a long day of teaching. He'd been her mentor since her graduate studies, and over the years, their relationship had evolved into something closer to friendship, though lately, she'd noticed something else in the way he looked at her. "Just making sure everything's ready," she replied, gesturing to the array of equipment spread across the lab bench. "Want to help me calibrate these sensors?" Daniel moved closer, picking up one of the devices. "You know, there's still time to reconsider doing this alone. The department could probably arrange for a research assistant to accompany you." Anna shook her head, focusing on the equipment in front of her. "I need to do this by myself, Daniel. You know that." "I know you're capable," he said softly. "That's not what worries me." The lab fell silent except for the quiet beeping of the sensors as they worked. Anna could feel the weight of unspoken words between them, the things neither of them quite dared to say. The evening light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Later that night, they ended up sharing takeout Chinese food on the lab floor, surrounded by maps and equipment. Daniel told stories about his own field research days, making Anna laugh with tales of mishaps and unexpected discoveries. As the hours wore on, the conversation grew more serious. "Remember that gorilla family we observed last year?" Daniel asked, pushing his empty container aside. "The way the mother cared for her injured infant? That's the kind of behavior we still don't fully understand." Anna nodded, remembering the gentle way the mother gorilla had tended to her baby's wound. "That's exactly what I want to study. There's so much about their social bonds we haven't documented yet." "Just promise me one thing," Daniel said, his voice taking on an unusual intensity. Promise you'll use the satellite phone if anything goes wrong. Don't try to be a hero." "I promise," Anna replied, meeting his eyes. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Before she could stop herself, Anna leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sent her heart racing. When she pulled back, Daniel looked stunned. "I'm sorry," she stammered, getting to her feet. "I shouldn't have." "Anna, wait." Daniel caught her hand. The touch sent electricity through her arm. "Stay." What followed was a night that would haunt Anna's memories in the months to come. They made love on the old couch in Daniel's office, their passion mixed with a desperate awareness that this might be goodbye. Neither of them spoke about what it meant or what might come after. In the early morning hours, Anna slipped away while Daniel slept, leaving only a note that said, "Thank you." She couldn't bear a proper goodbye, couldn't risk letting her resolve weaken. The expedition had to come first. The next day dawned bright and clear as Anna drove to the small airstrip where a bush pilot would take her to the edge of the jungle. Her colleagues had arranged a small send-off, complete with coffee and donuts. She accepted their hugs and well wishes, noticing that Daniel wasn't among them. As she climbed into the small plane, Anna felt a surge of excitement overshadowing her nervousness. The gorillas were waiting out there, and she was ready to unlock their secrets. The world below grew smaller as they took off, the city giving way to increasingly wild terrain. The pilot, a weather-beaten man named Mike, broke the silence after about an hour. "Last chance to change a mind, Doc. These jungles, they're not like anything you've seen before." Anna smiled, watching the endless green canopy below. "I'm counting on it." As they approached the landing strip, little more than a cleared stretch of dirt, Anna felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, where she could make her mark on the world. The mysteries of the jungle beckoned, promising discoveries that could change our understanding of these remarkable creatures. The small plane touched down with a bump, stirring up red dust. Anna shouldered her heavy pack, taking her first breath of the thick, humid air. The wall of green before her seemed almost alive, pulsing with hidden life and secrets waiting to be discovered. "Remember," Mike called as she started walking toward the tree line, "I'll be back in 3 months unless I hear otherwise on the radio. Good luck, Doc." Anna raised a hand in farewell, not looking back. The jungle swallowed her up, and with each step, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rich symphony of forest life. She was finally where she belonged, ready to begin the adventure of a lifetime. If only she had known then how that adventure would change her forever. The first few days in the jungle felt like a dream to Anna. Everything was intensely green, the air thick enough to drink, and the sounds, God, the sounds were everywhere. Birds she couldn't name called to each other in the canopy above. Insects hummed constantly, creating a background noise that never quite faded away. Even the leaves seemed to whisper as they brushed against each other in the gentle breeze. She'd set up her base camp in a small clearing, close enough to a stream to have fresh water, but far enough from any animal paths to avoid unwanted visitors. Her tent wasn't much, but it kept the rain off and the bugs out, mostly. Every morning, she'd wake up to condensation dripping from the tent's ceiling, her sleeping bag slightly damp despite her best efforts. Note to self, she mumbled into her voice recorder. Day 5. The humidity is worse than expected. Everything I own is starting to smell like mold. She clicked off the recorder and added another tally mark to her calendar. It felt important to keep track of the days, though time seemed to move differently here. The work itself was slow going. Anna spent hours each day hiking through the dense undergrowth, looking for signs of gorilla activity, broken branches, half-eaten fruits, fresh droppings. She mapped everything meticulously, marking coordinates on her GPS and taking detailed notes. The gorillas were out there. She just needed to be patient. But the jungle had its own plans. Simple tasks became challenging adventures. Just getting water meant a careful climb down slippery rocks to the stream. Cooking became a battle against curious monkeys who'd try to steal her food the moment she turned her back. Even going to the bathroom required checking for snakes and spiders first. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, Anna lost her footing on a moss-covered log and went down hard. She landed awkwardly, twisting her ankle. The pain shot up her leg like lightning. Shit, 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 she hissed, sitting in the mud and examining her ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was definitely sprained. She thought about Daniel's words about using the satellite phone, but pride kept her from reaching for it. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd trained for. It took her 3 hours to hobble back to camp, using a broken branch as a walking stick. That night, as she sat outside her tent with her ankle wrapped and elevated, the jungle seemed different. The familiar sounds took on a more menacing tone. Every rustle in the darkness could be a predator. Every shadow might hide something dangerous. But then something strange happened. As she sat there, feeling sorry for herself, she started to notice patterns in the chaos. The insects had different songs for different times of night. The fruit bats followed specific paths between the trees. Even the wind changed direction at predictable intervals. Days turned into weeks, and Anna's ankle healed. She got better at moving through the jungle, learned to step where the ground was firmest, to duck under vines instead of pushing through them. Her body adapted too. Muscles she never knew she had grew stronger, and her skin tanned despite the constant shade of the canopy. The first time she saw gorillas, she almost missed them. They were so perfectly part of the landscape that her eyes slid right past them at first. A family group, feeding peacefully in a small clearing. Anna's hands shook as she set up her camera and began taking notes. For adults, 2 juveniles, she whispered into her recorder. The silverback seems older, very calm demeanor. They're using their hands to test the ripeness of the fruits before picking them. Fascinating tool assessment behavior. She stayed absolutely still for hours, watching them go about their daily routine. When they finally moved on, she felt like she'd been holding her breath the entire time. That night, back at camp, she couldn't stop smiling as she reviewed her footage and notes. But it was the next encounter that would change everything. Anna was following some fresh tracks when she heard branches breaking nearby. She froze, her heart pounding. Through the leaves, she saw him. The largest silverback she'd ever encountered. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed impossible for his size. The gorilla, whom she would later name Kudo, seemed different from the others she'd observed. There was something in his eyes, a kind of awareness that made her breath catch. He looked directly at her, showing no fear or aggression, just curiosity. "Hello, big guy," she whispered, barely moving her lips. The gorilla tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, to her amazement, he sat down about 30 feet away and began eating, keeping her in his peripheral vision. That first meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Anna took notes until her hand cramped, documenting every movement, every gesture. When Kudo finally moved on, she realized she'd been so focused on him that she'd lost track of her surroundings completely. The jungle had grown darker, and she had to hurry back to camp before night fell. In the weeks that followed, Anna's research took on a new focus. She kept running into Kudo, or maybe he kept finding her. She wasn't sure. He seemed to travel alone most of the time, unusual for a silverback his age. His behavior didn't match anything she'd read about in her years of research. Day 43, she recorded one evening. Kudo showed up at the north clearing again today. He seems to be following a pattern, but it's not like any territorial behavior I've documented before. He's not marking boundaries or challenging other males. It's almost like he's patrolling. The longer she stayed in the jungle, the more her own behavior began to change. She stopped worrying about keeping her clothes clean or her hair neat. The satellite phone stayed buried in her pack and used. She began to move more quietly, to smell changes in the air that meant rain was coming. Her dreams were filled with green shadows and the sound of leaves rustling. Food became a challenge as her supplies dwindled. She'd planned for this, learning about edible plants and fruits, but theory was different from practice. Her first attempt at eating a wild fruit ended with her throwing up behind a tree. After that, she started watching what the monkeys ate and following their lead. One morning, she woke to find some ripe fruits placed near her tent. At first, she thought they must have fallen from the trees above, but the arrangement was too deliberate. The fruits were all perfectly ripe, carefully selected. She looked around but saw no sign of Kudo or any other gorillas. That was when the dream started. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure she'd heard someone calling her name, only to find the jungle as empty as ever. Sometimes she thought she saw shadows moving just at the edge of her vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Her notes became more disjointed. Scientific observations gave way to personal reflections. She wrote about the way the moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns that seemed to hold meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She described the feeling of being watched by the jungle itself, as if the entire forest was aware of her presence. "I think I'm starting to understand something," she recorded one night, her voice barely a whisper. "This place, it's not just an ecosystem. It's more like a single organism. And somehow, Kudo knows how to navigate it. He's not just surviving here, he's part of it. And I think he's trying to show me how to be part of it too." The research equipment she'd brought began to feel unnecessary, even intrusive. The data she was collecting couldn't capture what she was experiencing. How could you measure the feeling of being accepted by the jungle? How could you quantify the way the forest breathed at night? Her last radio check-in with the research station was brief and distracted. She assured them she was fine, that her research was progressing well, but she couldn't find the words to explain what was really happening. How could she tell them about Kudo, about the way the jungle was changing her? As the weeks wore on, the line between observer and observed began to blur. Anna found herself moving more like the gorillas, testing fruits the way they did, following their rhythms of rest and activity. She stopped checking her calendar, stopped counting the days. Time became measured in sunrises and rainstorms, in the ripening of fruits and the phases of the moon. And always, there was Kudo, a constant presence at the edge of her world. Sometimes she'd go days without seeing him, only to find fresh fruits by her tent in the morning. Other times he'd spend hours near her camp, close enough that she could hear his breathing. She began to feel safer when he was around, though she couldn't explain why. The jungle had claimed her, and she didn't want to be found. The research station's first hint that something was wrong came when Anna missed her weekly radio check-in. Dr. Sarah Chen, the project coordinator, tried to push down her worry as she attempted to reach Anna again. "Base to Anna, do you copy? This is Dr. Chen, please respond." The radio crackled with static. Sarah checked her watch. It had been exactly 8 days since their last contact. Anna had never missed a check-in before. "She's probably just having equipment troubles," Mark, one of the junior researchers, suggested. But his voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Sarah's stomach tighten. They waited another day before calling Daniel. He was in the middle of a lecture when his phone buzzed with the news. The students watched in confusion as their usually composed professor suddenly gathered his things and rushed out of the room mid-sentence. The drive to the research station felt endless. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. He remembered their last night together, the things left unsaid, the way she'd slipped away in the morning, leaving only that brief note. At the station, Sarah showed him the logs of Anna's last transmission. "She sounded different," Sarah said, frowning at her notes. "Distracted, maybe, or just tired." But she insisted everything was fine. They organized a preliminary search team within hours. The local authorities were notified, but everyone knew that in terrain this rough, time was critical. Daniel insisted on joining the first helicopter sweep, despite Sarah's protests about his lack of field experience. From the air, the jungle looked like an endless green carpet, revealing nothing of what might lie beneath. The pilot circled Anna's last known coordinates repeatedly, but the dense canopy made it impossible to spot any signs of her camp. "There!" Daniel shouted suddenly, pointing at a small break in the trees. The helicopter descended as low as it safely could, and they could just make out a flash of blue, and his tent, partially collapsed but still standing. The ground team reached the camp the next day. What they found made little sense. Anna's equipment was scattered around the clearing, some of it damaged by weather, but some perfectly intact. Her laptop sat unopened in the tent, its battery dead. The satellite phone was still in its waterproof case and used. "Look at this," one of the search team members called out. He held up Anna's journal, its pages warped from humidity, but still readable. The early entries were detailed and scientific, exactly what you'd expect from a researcher of her caliber. But as they flipped through, the notes became increasingly strange. Daniel read the last entry aloud, his voice shaking slightly. "The jungle doesn't want me to leave. Or maybe I don't want to leave the jungle. The lines are blurring now. Kudo understands. He's been trying to tell me something important. I think I'm finally ready to listen." The search expanded over the following days. Teams of local guides and volunteers combed the area, calling Anna's name until their voices grew hoarse. They found tracks, but they led in circles or ended abruptly. It was as if she had simply vanished into the green. Media outlets picked up the story quickly. Missing researcher Mystery's Jungle, made for compelling headlines. Reporters descended on the research station, asking questions no one could answer. They interviewed Anna's colleagues, her mother, anyone who might provide a clue to her disappearance. "She was one of our most promising researchers," the university dean told reporters, looking appropriately concerned for the cameras. "We're doing everything possible to find her." But as weeks passed, hope began to fade. Some suggested she might have fallen victim to poachers, though there was no evidence of criminal activity. Others whispered about mental breakdown, pointing to her increasingly erratic journal entries. A few even suggested she might have staged her own disappearance for publicity. Only Daniel seemed to understand that the truth might be something else entirely. He spent hours poring over her notes, trying to piece together what had happened in those final weeks. The Anna he knew wouldn't have simply wandered off or given up. Something had changed her out there in the jungle. Meanwhile, deep in the jungle, Anna was experiencing time differently. Days blended together in a green haze. She'd abandoned her tent after a heavy rain had partially collapsed it, finding more comfort in a natural shelter formed by the twisted roots of an ancient tree. She was aware, in a distant way, that people must be looking for her. Sometimes she thought she heard helicopters or voices calling her name. But these sounds seemed to come from another world, one that felt less and less real to her. Kudo had become her constant companion. He seemed to understand her need for food and water, often leading her to fruit-bearing trees or clear streams. She noticed that other animals behaved differently when he was around. Even the normally aggressive forest buffalo gave them a wide berth. Her body adapted to her new life in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her feet grew tougher, better suited to walking barefoot through the undergrowth. Her eyes adjusted to seeing in the dim light under the canopy. Even her sense of smell changed, becoming more acute, helping her detect approaching rainstorms or nearby predators. But it was her mind that changed the most. The constant chatter of thoughts that had filled her head since childhood began to quiet. She stopped naming things, stopped trying to categorize and analyze everything she saw. Instead, she simply experienced the jungle as it was. One morning, she found herself watching a group of young gorillas playing. Their movements were so natural, so perfectly suited to their environment. Without thinking, she began to imitate them, learning to move the way they did. Kudo watched her with what seemed like approval. She became aware of patterns she'd never noticed before, the way certain birds would call just before dawn, how the insects would fall silent when predators were near. The jungle was constantly communicating, and slowly, she was learning its language. Her old life felt like a dream now. She could barely remember what it felt like to wear clean clothes or sleep in a bed. The thought of returning to the world of computers and deadlines and fluorescent lights made her feel physically ill. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would think about Daniel. She remembered their last night together with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. He belonged to that other world, the one she was leaving behind. She hoped he would understand someday. The search teams came closer sometimes. She could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, calling her name. But she and Kudo had become expert at moving silently through the jungle. They would retreat deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick that no human path existed. One day, she found herself facing a small group of chimpanzees. In her old life, she would have been terrified. Chimps could be incredibly dangerous. But something had changed in how other animals perceived her. The chimps watched her curiously for a moment, then went about their business as if she were just another creature of the forest. Her relationship with Kudo deepened in ways she couldn't have imagined. They developed a kind of wordless communication based on subtle movements and expressions. She began to recognize different meanings in his grunts and gestures, while he seemed to understand her moods perfectly. The jungle had its own sense of time, marked not by hours and minutes, but by the rhythms of life itself. She learned to tell time by the position of the filtered sunlight, to predict weather by the behavior of the birds, to find food by following the paths of the monkeys. In her more lucid moments, she knew that what she was doing was unprecedented. No researcher had ever integrated so completely with their subject of study. But taking notes or recording observations seemed pointless now. The truth she was learning couldn't be captured in words or data. The world she had left behind continued to search for her, but Anna had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. In losing herself, she had found a new way of being. The mystery of her disappearance would only deepen in the months to come, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. The seasons changed slowly in the jungle, but Anna noticed the subtle shifts. The rains became more frequent, and new types of fruits began to ripen on the trees. She'd lost track of how long she'd been here, but her body told her many months had passed. Her days fell into a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. She'd wake before dawn, when the first birds began their songs, and move through the forest with Kudo. They'd spend the morning foraging, stopping at favorite spots where the sweetest fruits grew or where certain plants with edible roots could be found. Something had changed in their relationship, though Anna couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Kudo no longer simply tolerated her presence or watched over her like a curious guardian. They moved together now, like dancing partners who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. "You're different from the others, aren't you?" she said to him one day, her voice rough from lack of use. Kudo looked at her with those intelligent eyes, and she could have sworn he nodded slightly. Her strength had begun to fade, though. The physical demands of jungle life were catching up with her. Simple tasks like climbing to reach fruit or crossing streams became more challenging. Her body felt heavy, different. At first, she blamed it on the constant humidity and limited diet, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. One morning, she woke to find Kudo had gathered a pile of specific leaves near where she slept. She recognized them as the kind pregnant monkeys often ate. That's when it hit her, the tiredness, the changes in her body. She was pregnant. The realization should have terrified her, but somehow it didn't. She thought back to that last night with Daniel, counting the months in her head. It made sense now, why she'd been feeling so different lately. Kudo seemed to understand her condition before she did. He began bringing her softer fruits, easier to digest. He'd wait patiently when she needed to rest, which was happening more frequently now. When they traveled, he chose easier paths, avoiding the steep climbs and thick undergrowth. Anna found herself talking to him more, her voice growing stronger with use. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted one afternoon, resting against a tree trunk. "I can't go back now. They wouldn't understand." The gorilla sat nearby, methodically stripping leaves from a branch. His presence was comforting, solid. He'd gotten into the habit of sleeping nearby, his massive form acting as a deterrent to any predators that might threaten them. Her pregnancy progressed, and with it came new challenges. The morning sickness was brutal, made worse by the constant humidity and the limited options for food. But Kudo seemed to know exactly what she needed. He'd bring her ginger-like roots that helped settle her stomach, and always made sure she had access to clean water. The jungle itself seemed to shift around her changing needs. She found herself drawn to certain areas where the ground was softer, where shelter from the rain was better. Or maybe she was just noticing these things more now that her body required them. She thought often of her mother during this time, wondering what advice she would give. Would she be horrified to know her daughter was preparing to give birth in the jungle? Or would she understand that Anna had found something here that she could never find in the civilized world? The baby moved inside her, strong and active, especially in the evenings when the jungle came alive with night sounds. Sometimes, when Kudo was nearby, the movement seemed more pronounced, as if the child could sense his presence. Food became an increasing concern. Anna knew she needed more protein than fruits alone could provide, but hunting was out of the question in her condition. Again, Kudo proved invaluable, leading her to places where she could find protein-rich insects and edible mushrooms. As her belly grew, Anna's thoughts turned more often to the future. She knew she couldn't stay in the deep jungle forever, not with a baby. But the thought of returning to civilization filled her with a deep sense of dread. How could she explain what had happened to her? How could she make them understand about Kudo? The gorilla's behavior became even more protective. He'd scout ahead when they moved to new areas, returning to guide her only when he was sure the path was safe. At night, he'd build simple nests nearby, something she'd never seen a male gorilla do for anyone outside their immediate family group. One afternoon, they encountered another gorilla group. In the past, Kudo had always led them away from other gorillas, but this time was different. The group included several females with babies, and they seemed to accept Anna's presence with unusual calm. She watched, fascinated, as the mother gorillas showed their infants to her, almost as if they were sharing parenting tips. "Is this what you wanted me to see?" she asked Kudo later. "That I'm not alone?" He responded by gently touching her swollen belly with one massive finger, a gesture so careful and deliberate that tears sprang to her eyes. The rainy season intensified, making survival more challenging. Anna's shelter needed constant repair to keep the water out. Her feet and ankles swelled in the humidity, making it harder to move around. But still, Kudo stayed with her, his presence a constant comfort in the increasingly difficult conditions. She began to prepare for the birth as best she could, gathering soft leaves for bedding and learning from watching the mother gorillas in the group they occasionally visited. She knew the risks of giving birth alone in the jungle, but somehow, she felt safer here than she would in a hospital. The pregnancy had changed her body in ways that went beyond the obvious physical changes. Her sense of smell became almost supernatural, warning her of approaching storms or nearby predators. Her hearing sharpened until she could distinguish between dozens of different bird calls and insect sounds. But it was her connection with Kudo that underwent the most profound transformation. They barely needed gestures anymore to communicate. She could sense his moods, his intentions, almost as if they shared a mind. When danger approached, a snake in the undergrowth or a storm on the horizon, she knew it because he knew it. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep eluded her, Anna would feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. She was probably the first human to ever experience this level of connection with another species. The scientist in her wanted to document everything, to share this incredible discovery with the world. But she knew that doing so would destroy the very thing she wanted to preserve. As her due date approached, Anna felt a growing sense of peace about her situation. Yes, she was alone in the jungle, far from medical care, preparing to give birth in conditions that most would consider primitive. But she wasn't really alone. She had Kudo, and through him, she had the jungle itself. The baby moved inside her, strong and healthy, and she talked to it constantly now. She told it about the jungle, about Kudo, about the incredible world it would be born into. She sang its songs from her childhood, her voice mixing with the natural sounds of the forest. One evening, as the sun set and the first stars appeared through gaps in the canopy, Anna felt the first contractions begin. She looked at Kudo, who sat nearby, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "It's time," she whispered, and somehow, she knew everything would be all right. The mysteries of her transformation would continue to deepen, but in that moment, on the threshold of bringing new life into the world, Anna felt more certain than ever that she had found her true path, even if it wasn't one anyone else would understand. The morning mist still clung to the trees when the villagers found her. They'd been tracking a herd of forest buffalo when they stumbled upon Anna gathering fruits at the edge of the jungle. She was thinner than when she'd disappeared, her clothes hanging in tatters, but her eyes were clear and alert. And she wasn't alone. A small bundle was strapped to her chest with vines and strips of cloth. At first, they thought she was a spirit. Local legends told of forest beings who looked human but weren't quite right. The way she moved, silent as a shadow, didn't seem human at all. But then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse, but still recognizable as human speech. "Please," she said, "I need help." The villagers took her to their community health center, where the local nurse, Maria, quickly realized this was the missing researcher everyone had been looking for. But the woman before her barely resembled the smiling photo from the missing persons bulletin. "The baby?" Maria asked gently, reaching for the bundle Anna clutched protectively. "She's mine," Anna replied, her words coming slowly, as if she had to remember how to form them. "She was born in the jungle. 3 weeks ago, I think. Time worked differently there." Word spread quickly. Within hours, the research station had been notified and a medical evacuation was arranged. Anna sat quietly through it all, responding to questions with short, simple answers, her eyes constantly darting to the windows as if looking for something or someone in the jungle beyond. The baby was surprisingly healthy, though small. Anna had somehow managed to keep them both alive and well in conditions that should have been impossible. When asked how she'd done it, she would only say, "I had help." Daniel was the first to reach her from the research station. He burst into the clinic, out of breath and disheveled, stopping short when he saw her. Anna was sitting on an examination table, feeding the baby with practiced ease. She looked up at him, and for a moment, neither spoke. "I know she's yours," she said finally, breaking the silence. From that last night, Daniel stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had his nose, his chin. There was no doubt. He reached out a trembling hand, but stopped short of touching her. "I named her Sophia," Anna continued. "It means wisdom." The medical team arrived soon after, full of questions and concerns. They marveled at Anna's condition. Despite living in the jungle for 10 months, she was remarkably healthy. Her muscles were strong, her reflexes sharp. Only her feet, tough as leather now, and her unusual posture hinted at what she'd been through. They wanted to transport her to a proper hospital, but Anna refused to leave the area. "I can't go too far," she insisted, though she wouldn't explain why. They compromised by moving her to a small guest house near the research station, where doctors could monitor her and Sophia while respecting her wishes to stay close to the jungle. The media descended like vultures. Reporters camped outside the guest house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the jungle mother, as they dubbed her. Their cameras flashed whenever anyone entered or left the building. Their questions grew increasingly sensational. Had she gone feral? Had she communicated with the animals? What about the father? Anna ignored them all. She spent her days caring for Sophia and staring out the windows toward the tree line. At night, she would sing soft, strange songs to the baby, songs that didn't sound quite human. Her mother arrived 3 days after Anna was found. The reunion was awkward, filled with unasked questions and careful silences. The older woman tried to help with the baby, to show Anna proper ways of doing things, but Anna had her own methods that seemed to work better. "You don't understand," Anna said one evening, after another failed attempt to get her to do things normally. "Everything's different now. I'm different." The doctors ran tests, took samples, asked endless questions. They were fascinated by the changes in her body: enhanced night vision, incredible balance, heightened senses of smell and hearing. Her blood work showed unusual antibodies they couldn't identify. Her brain scans revealed patterns of activity they'd never seen before. Daniel visited every day, spending hours with Sophia, trying to connect with both mother and daughter. Anna was gentle with him but distant, as if viewing him through a thick fog. When he tried to talk about their future, about arrangements for Sophia, Anna would change the subject or simply stop responding. "There's something you're not telling us," he said one afternoon, watching Anna pace the room with Sophia. "Something about how you survived out there." Anna paused by the window, adjusting Sophia in her arms. "Would you believe me if I told you? Try me." She turned to face him, and for a moment, he saw something wild and ancient in her eyes. "There was something that helped me, protected me, taught me." "The gorilla you wrote about in your journal? Kudo." Anna nodded slowly. "He's more than just a gorilla. He's different. Special. He understood things about the jungle, about life, that I never could have learned on my own. He kept us alive. Daniel wanted to argue, to point out how impossible it all sounded, but he couldn't deny the evidence before him. Anna and Sophia had survived against all odds. Something extraordinary had happened in that jungle. The research community was split between fascination and skepticism. Some wanted to study Anna, to understand how she'd adapted so completely to jungle life. Others dismissed her story entirely, suggesting she'd hidden in a village somewhere and made up the more fantastic elements of her tale. But Anna didn't care about their theories or their questions. Her concern was focused entirely on Sophia and something else. Something she wouldn't talk about. The locals noticed she was most active at dawn and dusk, when she would stand at her window or in the doorway, looking toward the jungle with an expression of longing and expectation. One morning, the night guard reported hearing strange sounds, something large moving in the undergrowth near the guest house. When they checked the security cameras, they caught a glimpse of a massive dark shape retreating into the trees. Anna, when questioned, just smiled. "He's still watching over us," she said simply. Sophia grew stronger each day, showing none of the health issues the doctors had feared. She was unusually alert for a newborn, her eyes tracking movement with uncanny focus. And sometimes, when the wind blew in from the jungle, she would turn her head toward it and make soft, curious sounds. The mystery of Anna's transformation deepened with each passing day. She was physically present in the world of humans again, but part of her seemed to remain in the jungle. She moved between these two realities like a creature of twilight, belonging fully to neither world, but somehow bridging both. Those who spent time with her began to notice subtle changes in themselves, a heightened awareness of natural sounds, a new sensitivity to weather changes, a strange sense of being watched by something ancient and wise. It was as if Anna had brought a piece of the jungle's magic back with her, and it touched everyone who came near. Sophia, born of both worlds, slept peacefully through it all, dreaming perhaps of the green cathedral where she had entered the world, and of the gentle giant who had helped bring her safely into it. The whispers started small but grew louder with each passing day. In the local cafes, at the research station, even in the halls of the university back home, people couldn't stop talking about Anna and her strange story. Every detail was picked apart, analyzed, debated. Anna felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. She'd moved into a small house on the outskirts of the research station's property, as close to the jungle as they would allow. The walls felt like a cage after so many months of freedom, but she endured it for Sophia's sake. Her health began to decline, though not in any way the doctors could properly diagnose. Blood tests came back normal, vital signs were stable, but something was clearly wrong. She lost weight despite eating well, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. "It's like she's homesick," Daniel observed one evening, watching Anna stare out the window for the 100th time that day. But not for any place we'd understand. The research community had turned hostile. Her former colleagues wrote papers questioning her mental stability, suggesting she'd fabricated parts of her story for attention. They pointed to inconsistencies in her timeline, to the impossibility of her survival claims. "Tell us about the gorilla again," they'd say in interviews, their voices dripping with skepticism. "The one that brought you food and protected you?" Anna stopped talking to reporters entirely. She turned down interview requests, refused book deals, ignored the growing stack of mail from television producers. The only person she really talked to anymore was Sophia, and those conversations were in a strange mix of English and soft, guttural sounds that made others uncomfortable. Daniel tried his best to shield them both from the worst of it. He took a leave of absence from the university to stay nearby, helping with Sophia and running interference with the endless stream of people wanting to study, interview, or simply gawk at Anna. "You don't have to stay," Anna told him one morning as he brought her tea. "You have your own life to get back to." "Sophia is my daughter too," he replied simply.
But they both knew it was more than that.
He was drawn to the mystery of what had happened to Anna, trying to reconcile the woman he'd known before with the person she'd become. The local villagers treated Anna differently than the scientists and reporters. They left small offerings outside her door, fresh fruits, handmade blankets for Sophia, protective amulets. They'd grown up with stories of the jungle's magic, and to them, Anna was living proof of what they'd always known. Sophia grew quickly, showing none of the frailty everyone had feared. At 3 months old, she was already more alert and coordinated than most babies her age. Her eyes, when she looked at you, seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her years. But it was her effect on animals that really got people talking. Birds would land nearby when she was outside, singing directly to her. The research station's normally skittish cats would curl up next to her blanket. Even snakes would slide away instead of striking when she was near. "She's marked by the jungle," the village elder told Daniel when he asked about it. "Both of them are. You can't spend that much time in the deep forest without it changing you." Anna's dreams became increasingly vivid. She would wake up covered in sweat, calling out in that strange language she developed in the jungle. Sometimes she'd grab Sophia and stand by the window, swaying and humming until the baby fell back asleep. The academic community demanded proof of her claims. They wanted data, measurements, evidence. But how do you measure a transformation of the soul? How do you quantify a connection to something as ancient and mysterious as the jungle itself? Anna's former research supervisor arrived uninvited one day, armed with questions and a barely concealed agenda. He wanted to salvage what he could of the research project to find something publishable in the ruins of Anna's academic career. "Just walk me through it scientifically," he pressed, his pen hovering over a notebook. "What exactly did you observe about the gorilla's behavior?" Anna had been playing with Sophia on the floor but stood up abruptly, her movements fluid and unnatural. "You still don't understand," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made the older man step back. "This isn't about data or observations. It's about something that science can't measure yet." The supervisor left shortly after, muttering about stress-induced delusions and the need for psychiatric evaluation. His report to the university recommended terminating any further funding for Anna's research. Daniel found her later that night, sitting on the back porch with Sophia, speaking softly to the darkness. He could have sworn he saw movement in the tree line, something large shifting in the shadows. "They'll never believe you, will they?" he asked, settling down beside her. "No," she replied. "And that's probably for the better. Some things aren't meant to be studied or explained. They're meant to be experienced." Sophia stirred in her sleep, making those peculiar sounds that were neither quite human nor quite animal. Anna responded instinctively with similar noises, and the babies settled immediately. The price of mystery, Anna was learning, was isolation. The more she held on to her truth, the more others pulled away. Former friends stopped calling. Colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. Only Daniel remained constant, though even he struggled to understand. Her mother's visits became shorter and more strained. The older woman couldn't hide her discomfort when Anna would suddenly tilt her head, listening to sounds no one else could hear, or when Sophia would laugh at empty air. "Maybe you should come home for a while," her mother suggested during her last visit. "Get some proper help, you know?" But they both knew that wasn't possible. Home wasn't a place anymore for Anna. It was a state of being she could only find at the edge of the jungle, where the civilized world faded into green mystery. The physical symptoms grew worse. Anna developed headaches that no medication could touch. Her skin became hypersensitive to artificial lights and sounds. She could only sleep during the day if the windows were open to the jungle breeze. Sophia, at least, thrived. She grew strong and healthy, her laughter filling the small house with joy. She showed no interest in normal baby toys, preferring leaves and stones that Anna brought in from outside. By 6 months, she could mimic bird calls perfectly. At night, when the humidity was high and the moon was full, Anna would sometimes take Sophia to the edge of their yard, as close to the jungle as she dared. There, she would tell her daughter's stories, not the usual fairy tales, but stories about Kudo, about the wisdom of the forest, about the things she'd learned during those mysterious months. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you might hear an answering rumble from the darkness beyond the trees. A sound that was neither quite human nor quite animal, but something in between. A reminder that some mysteries, once lived, can never be fully explained. The price of mystery was high, but Anna paid it willingly. She had glimpsed something profound in the jungle, something that had changed her forever. If others couldn't understand, if they wanted to label her as crazy or delusional, so be it. She had Sophia. She had her memories. And she had the knowledge that somewhere out there, in the deep green heart of the jungle, Kudo was watching, waiting, protecting them still in his own way. The mystery had marked them both, mother and daughter, and though the world might never understand, they carried its truth in their bones, in their dreams, in the wild wisdom of their transformed hearts. Sarah Chun hadn't expected to find Anna waiting for her at the research station that morning. In the 8 months since Anna's return, they'd barely spoken. But there she was, Sophia strapped to her chest in a homemade sling, looking more composed than Sarah had seen her in months. "I need to tell someone the whole story," Anna said simply. "And you're the only one who might understand." They settled in Sarah's office, the familiar smell of old books and coffee bringing back memories of easier times. Sophia played quietly with a leaf, making those strange sounds that always made Sarah's skin prickle. "Everyone's been so focused on Kudo," Anna began, her voice steady, "on the mystery of how I survived. They're all missing the simple truth because they're looking for something more dramatic." Sarah stayed quiet, letting Anna find her words. Outside, rain began to fall, a soft tropical shower that filled the silence between them. "I slept with Daniel the night before I left," Anna continued. "We both knew it was goodbye, but neither of us said it. Sophia is his daughter. There's nothing mysterious about her conception. It was just two people finding comfort in each other before a long separation." The rain grew heavier, drumming on the tin roof. Sophia looked up at the sound, making a soft cooing noise that seemed to match its rhythm. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Sarah asked gently. Anna smiled, a strange, sad smile that made her look both younger and older than her years.
"No, it's not."
"The truth is both simpler and more complicated than anyone's guessed." She told Sarah about those first weeks in the jungle, about twisting her ankle and fighting to survive, about how Kudo had appeared just when she needed help most, about how their connection had grown slowly, naturally, like a vine climbing towards sunlight. "He wasn't just a gorilla who helped me survive," Anna explained. He became something more. A teacher, I guess you could say. He showed me how to see the jungle differently, how to be part of it instead of just studying it." Sophia stirred in her sling, reaching out toward the window where the rain continued to fall. Anna adjusted her position with practiced ease, never breaking the flow of her story. "The pregnancy changed everything. Kudo seemed to know before I did. His behavior shifted. He became more protective, more deliberate in how he helped me. He wasn't just keeping me alive anymore. He was teaching me what I'd need to know to keep Sophia alive." Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite her scientific skepticism. There was something compelling about Anna's quiet certainty, about the way Sophia seemed to respond to her mother's words with those strange, knowing sounds. "The local people have a word for it," Anna continued. "They call it forest wisdom. When the jungle chooses to teach someone its secrets, they say it happens maybe once in a generation. Usually to their shamans or healers, never to an outsider until me." The rain eased, leaving behind that peculiar jungle silence that feels more alive than quiet. Sophia had fallen asleep, her small face peaceful against Anna's chest. "I'm not crazy, Sarah. I'm not suffering from delusions or Stockholm Syndrome or whatever else they've suggested. What happened to me was real. It just wasn't what everyone assumed it was." Sarah sat back in her chair, processing what she'd heard. Outside, birds had begun their after-rain chorus, their calls mixing with the drip of water from leaves. "Why tell me this now?" she asked finally. "Because the rumors are getting worse," Anna replied. "People are starting to say horrible things about Sophia, about her conception. I need someone in the scientific community to know the truth. To understand that what happened in the jungle was extraordinary, yes, but not in the way they think." She explained how Kudo had taught her to find safe food, how to move silently through the forest, how to read the weather and avoid predators. But more than that, he'd shown her a different way of being in the world. The pregnancy was completely normal, just a human baby growing inside a human mother. What wasn't normal was how I learned to survive, how I learned to trust my instincts, how I learned to let go of everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Sarah thought about the changes she'd observed in Anna since her return. The way she moved, the way she seemed to sense things before they happened, the way animals responded to her presence. And Sophia? Sarah asked carefully. She seems different. Anna smiled, stroking her daughter's dark hair. She is different. Not because of anything supernatural, but because she was born into that wisdom. She's never known any other way of being. The jungle shaped her from her first breath. The explanation was both perfectly rational and deeply mysterious. It answered the basic questions while hinting at deeper truths that defied scientific analysis. I need your help, Sarah, Anna continued. Not to prove anything. I'm done trying to prove things to people who won't understand. But to protect Sophia. To make sure there's someone in the academic world who knows the real story. Sarah looked at her old friend, seeing both the scientist she'd known and the transformed being she'd become. What do you want me to do? Just remember what I've told you. And when people start spreading rumors or demanding explanations, remind them that sometimes the simplest truth is the most profound. Sophia is Daniel's daughter, born in extraordinary circumstances, taught by the jungle from her first moments. That's all they need to know. The office had grown darker as they talked, the afternoon light failing in the way it does in the tropics, suddenly and completely. Sophia stirred in her sleep, making those peculiar sounds that seemed to bridge the gap between human speech and forest song. There's one more thing, Anna said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Kudos still visits. Not often, and never when anyone else is around. But he watches over us. Not because there's anything supernatural about our connection, but because he chose to teach me, and I chose to learn. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, remembering the security camera footage of something large moving in the shadows near Anna's house. The truth isn't always simple, Anna concluded, standing to leave. But sometimes it's simpler than the stories we create to explain it. I fell in love with Daniel, got pregnant, and then learned to survive in the jungle with help from an extraordinary creature who chose to teach me rather than fear me. Everything else is just people trying to make mysteries out of things they don't understand. As Anna and Sophia disappeared into the gathering darkness, Sarah sat at her desk for a long time, thinking about truth and mystery, about science and wisdom, about the things we can explain and the things we can only experience. Outside, a strange call echoed from the jungle. Not quite human, not quite animal. Sarah couldn't tell if it came from Anna, from Sophia, or from something else entirely. And maybe, she realized, that was exactly the point. 5 years passed like leaves carried on a jungle stream. Sophia grew into a remarkable child, with Daniel's dark curls and Anna's knowing eyes. They lived in their small house at the edge of the forest, not quite part of the human world, and not quite separate from it. The research station had gradually accepted Anna's presence, treating her as something between a colleague and a local legend. She occasionally helped with projects, offering insights that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than scientific observation. Students would seek her out, asking questions that went beyond academic curiosity. How do you know when a storm is coming? They'd ask, watching her gather Sophia from the yard hours before the first clouds appeared. You listen, she'd reply simply, not just with your ears. Sophia started school in the village, where the local children accepted her strange ways without question. She could speak 3 languages fluently, English, the local dialect, and something else that made the village elders nod knowingly when they heard it. Daniel split his time between the university and their home, learning to navigate the space between the world he understood and the one Anna and Sophia inhabited. He had given up trying to explain their situation to his colleagues, instead focusing on being present for his daughter's unique upbringing. Daddy, why don't you hear the songs? Sophia asked him once, as they sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. What songs, sweetheart? The ones the jungle sings. Mama says they're always playing, but not everyone knows how to listen. He looked at his daughter, her small face serious in the fading light, and felt the familiar mix of wonder and uncertainty that came with raising a child who saw the world so differently. Anna's health had stabilized over the years, though she never quite readjusted to indoor living. She spent most of her days outside, teaching Sophia the things she'd learned during her time in the jungle. They would disappear for hours into the forest's edge, returning with baskets of fruits and stories that made Daniel's scientific mind spin. The academic world had mostly forgotten about them, moving on to other mysteries and controversies. Occasionally, a journalist or researcher would show up, drawn by the lingering rumors of the jungle woman and her unusual child. They usually left disappointed, finding only a quiet family living a simple life on the forest's edge. But those who stayed longer, who watched more carefully, began to notice things. How the local wildlife behaved differently around Anna and Sophia. How the two of them seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know. How the jungle itself seemed more alive, more aware when they were near. Sarah Chun remained their strongest ally in the scientific community, deflecting inquiries with practiced ease and maintaining the simple explanation they'd agreed upon years ago. But privately, she kept detailed notes about the changes she observed in both mother and daughter. "The transformation didn't end when you came back, did it?" she asked Anna one evening, watching Sophia communicate with a group of birds using those strange, fluid sounds. Anna smiled, the same mysterious smile that had never quite left her face since her return. "It's still happening. Every day. To both of us." Kudo's visits had become rare but remained significant. Sometimes on full moon nights, they would find fresh fruits on their doorstep, arranged in patterns that Sophia could read like letters. Other times, they would wake to find evidence that something large had kept watch over their house during the night. Sophia grew up knowing him as a kind of uncle, a presence that moved between the worlds just as she did. She was never afraid of the jungle or its creatures, treating them all with a familiar respect that made even hardened skeptics pause. "He's teaching her now," Anna told Daniel one night, after they'd watched their daughter have what appeared to be a silent conversation with something just beyond the tree line. "The same way he taught me, but from the beginning. She won't have to unlearn things the way I did." Daniel had learned to accept these moments, these glimpses of a reality he could study, but never fully understand. His research had taken a different direction over the years, focusing on the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. His colleagues found his new interests oddly unscientific, but he no longer cared. The village children called Sophia Jungle Girl, not as an insult, but as a kind of title. They sought her out when they needed to find lost pets, or when someone was sick. She would close her eyes, make those strange singing sounds, and point unerringly in the right direction. One day, they found her teaching her friends to listen to the forest songs. The children sat in a circle, eyes closed, swaying slightly as Sophia walked among them, humming that otherworldly tune. To everyone's amazement, birds began to gather, adding their voices to her song. "What exactly are you teaching them?" her teacher asked afterward, both concerned and fascinated. "How to hear what's already there," Sophia replied with the simple wisdom of a child who had never known any other way. As Sophia grew, so did her abilities. She could predict weather changes days in advance, know when animals were sick or injured, find lost things with uncanny accuracy. But unlike her mother's dramatic transformation, Sophia's gifts seemed natural, as much a part of her as her dark curls and quick smile. Anna watched her daughter grow with a deep sense of satisfaction. The price they'd paid for their mystery, the isolation, the whispers, the skepticism, seemed small compared to the gift of seeing Sophia move so effortlessly between worlds. The jungle had changed too, or perhaps they just noticed it more. The border between forest and civilization seemed more permeable around their house. Plants grew with unusual vigor in their garden. Animals that normally avoided human settlement would venture close, drawn by something they sensed in the child who spoke their language. Daniel had finally stopped trying to document everything to find scientific explanations for what he witnessed. Instead, he learned to simply be present, to share in the wonder of raising a child who had inherited not just his genes, but a kind of wisdom that went beyond blood. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked Anna one evening, as they watched Sophia sleeping peacefully, her dreams filled with those strange sounds that were neither quite human nor quite animal. No, Anna replied, her hand absently stroking their daughter's hair. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived. And so they lived, this unusual family, in the space between worlds. Sophia grew up knowing both the language of science and the songs of the jungle, bridging gaps that others didn't even know existed. Anna continued to guard her deeper secrets while sharing what wisdom she could with those ready to learn. And somewhere in the dark depths of the forest, Kudo remained, a shadow guardian of the mystery that had transformed one woman's life and given birth to a child who would carry that transformation forward into a future where the boundaries between human and nature, between known and unknown, grew ever more fluid. The mystery lived on in their blood, in their dreams, in the strange songs Sophia sang to the birds, and in the way Anna still turned her head at sounds only she could hear. It lived in the way their garden grew, in the animals that sought them out, in the stories the villagers told about the family who spoke the jungle's language. But most of all, it lived in the simple truth that some things can't be explained, only experienced. And in that truth, they found their peace.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.